tackling a lot of different industries and verticals as it relates to digital transformation over the last several months. I think this is our 17th edition of CDX and our weekly digital roundtable. First of all, I'll start off as a New Yorker and as someone who was here during 9/11, that it is very much top of mind. And all those who lost their lives here in Washington and Shanksville, they're on our mind. We still think a lot about it here in New York, and I certainly wanted to acknowledge that out at the top. And today we're talking about the future of learning, the future of education. Obviously, we're all aware in the last 6 months, everything has been sort of turned upside down, and digital transformation is accelerating and certainly has impacted the education, higher learning, executive education industry. And very pleased to have two great experts here. And we got a little bit of an international flavor today since David is logging in from Lausanne. And Evan, it's great to see you as well. So let's do just some quick introductions. Evan, we'll start with you. And I know that you're in a bit of a transition, so let us know what you were doing, and then let us know what you think you're going to be doing.
Sure, thanks, Drew. So Ivan's Trikenberger, 19 years in the US, almost to that day. I was in New York on September 11. And I think it's a great testimony of the resilience of that country. So sadly, but I think it's a fantastic lesson in life. Until most recently, I was the president of Pearson Online Learning Services, which is a $350 million business working with universities around the world to create, support, and recruit for online degrees, online programs. And I spent most of my career between consulting, media, and education.
Wonderful.
I'm delighted to be here today.
It's great to have you here. Thank you. And David, great to have you joining us from a very beautiful place, to be sure. But share with us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I mean, transition is also in some ways something that describes my current situation. I arrived here at IMD Business School in Lausanne a little over 2 months ago. I spent the previous 8 years on the faculty of the Yale School of Management in Connecticut. Before that, I was in Madrid for 8 years at a business school called IE Business School. And before that, I was in the US for 8 years to get an education. So in my case, it's sort of every 8 years, I seem to have an urge to move to the other side of the Atlantic. I'm originally from Germany, so I picked a hell of a time to do a transatlantic and institutional move. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the contrast between the two settings geographically and institutionally.
No, indeed. And in fact, I believe the announcement for your relatively new post was in February, but you started July 1st. So you really had sort of the entire time that we've been through COVID, right through the heart of it, to think about, innovation at your next stop. So we'll definitely dig into that. Well, why don't we start with, I always like to get the synapses firing a little bit. What's top of mind? And David, why don't we just continue on with you right here? What's top of mind for you today? Whether you might have read an interesting article yesterday, might have seen an interesting technology or had a great chat with someone, but what's top of mind for you today?
I mean, top of mind really is the excitement about the fact that something that I've been passionate about for 15 years, really, the potential of technology to transform, and in my case, higher education, especially adult learning, suddenly having the impact that I always felt it could have. I mean, more things have changed in higher education in the past 6 months than, the previous 6 years for sure, maybe 60 years, maybe even more than that. There are a lot of very open questions, but there's this sense of excitement and of opportunity. And so, I had somebody visit this morning. I took her around campus, and there were two things that she noticed. One, there aren't a whole lot of students, and the second, most rooms now have video screens in them, cameras in them. Faculty doing very different kind of work, and so that's top of mind. How different it feels to be at a campus that is a technology hub as opposed to just a physical convening space.
Right, indeed. Ivan, what's top of mind for you today?
Well, I don't like to agree with my fellow panelists. It's too easy, but I would completely share David's enthusiasm. I think I've been waiting for that moment for 15 years. Finally, the time when things are going to pick up speed and this acceleration of disruption in education. And I truly think for the better. I mean, there is a lot of comments about the pain and challenges of what people refer to as remote teaching. This is not online education. That's very different. And I think we're going to see in the next few months, a few years, really the real value of technology, AI, the ability to personalize education, the ability to learn wherever you are, whenever you are, not only basically when you're 15, 18, and 20 years old going to college, but, at the age of 20, 40, 60, either for fun or for better jobs. So it's, despite the human cost of COVID and the challenges to the economy, I think it's a formidable accelerator of innovation for an industry which typically has been struggling to evolve and change. And that's some pioneers like David and others who try, but it's tough. There's a lot of inertia in the system. Stakeholders don't have a lot of reasons to change. I mean, they've done very well by staying where they are, whether it's the publishers, institutions, and others. So very excited to see the pressure being put on those players, including those I work for, to change and do things differently.
No, that's great. Before we jump into the meat of the discussion, I'd sort of like to talk a little bit about, I know, David, you're relatively new, and even you literally, I think, only just left last Friday, but so you've had a lot of time from the management perspective. And how has COVID changed both of your approaches to sort of managing and leading, and how have your organizations responded, to COVID during this time? And David, why don't I put it back to you and take that on?
So, IMD is a very distinctive business school. Among top business schools, we're the only one that is really focused on executive education, sort of non-degree programs that we design either for corporate clients or that we run in an open format, and we do several hundred of them every year, and they tend to be anywhere from 3 weeks to several months long. And degree programs are a much smaller part of what we do, and so. For us, this has really meant that the biggest part of what we do just isn't feasible anymore the way we had done it. By one estimate, about 90% of our revenue depends on somebody getting on a plane, faculty traveling somewhere, participants coming here, and that's just not happening, or at least not happening in the way that it used to happen. And so I think the way it has really changed our approach is that, Iwan was sort of picking up on the efforts to transform higher education. They usually used to be somewhat fringe, right? You would run like one program that was different, you'd experiment a little bit over here. This is the core of the enterprise, and that means that the speed of experimentation has picked up, because every single thing that you do is an opportunity to innovate and to experiment, and a need to do that. And so it's really been moving innovation sort of from the edge of the organization to the very core, realizing that we're reinventing in real time, really across the board, across everything that we do. And so how do we do that responsibly while serving our clients? How do we identify what works, what doesn't? How do we diffuse it? It's a very different enterprise than the sort of carefully controlled experiments at the fringes that I think most of higher education has been engaged in when it comes to technology.
Right, and even as you answer that same question, sort of as well, maybe just give folks, I know you're not there anymore, but your recent experiences have really been so spot on to what we're talking about today. What Pearson is, for some context, and what your role there was, and then how you had been managing that the last 6 months during this transition.
Sure. So quickly context. So I left Pearson literally a week ago. It's been a great experience. I had a great time over there. This world is changing so fast. I was really excited about looking at another angle there, but fantastic company. Pearson is a $4 billion company, headquartered of London. The bulk of the business is in the US. A lot of people know Pearson for the textbooks you've bought in K-12 or higher ed. This is, I'm not telling you, it's rather a challenge business. Fewer people buy textbooks, especially richly priced textbooks, and I will leave it there. And so it's a business. The whole Pearson is going through massive transition and reinventing itself from sort of shifting away from these quasi-addictive, high-margin textbook business to other services and solutions. The business I run is different. It's a $350 million business, very much future-looking, really at the core of this transformation. And funnily enough, people think online learning is pretty new, but the company I've been running the last 3 years is 20 years old. So we've been working with universities around the country and the world actually to create and run those programs for over 20 years. Big acceleration the last few months. I will come back on that. I think on your question, Drew, it's very interesting because both Pearson and COVID, I would use the word schizophrenic, and I'll tell you why. Schizophrenic because on one side, COVID is, stressful. There is a lack of certainty. So there's a tendency to put your head in the sand, do your work, just don't make waves. But in parallel, there's also the realization that now is the time to change things. And if you're a public company under pressure with mature businesses and fast-growing businesses, it's a very, very complex process to go through a complex time. More personally, my leadership team was spread across multiple states and cities. We've been virtual since day one. I live in Atlanta. We don't have an office here. My main offices were Chicago, Toronto, in Arizona, and in Florida. So we've been operating, and Pearson does operate virtually for a long time. So I would say not much change here. I think for the 1,300 employees we have, the need to be close to them, to talk to them regularly, to reassure them, to tell them that the world is not going away. It's an exciting time. So it's really more communication, transparency, and getting them excited about the future. Just one quick anecdote, which is interesting. For the last 2 years, I tried to convince my leadership team to move all our call center and marketing folks working from home. And I faced tons of resistance. The second COVID hit, that became a no-brainer, except we realized that all our call center folks did not have a laptop. So we literally had to get organized to get 500 people shifting from working in the office to home. And the reason I said is going back to resilience is when you're under pressure, it's amazing to see how people can move fast and be creative. So I think, again, in the same vein as 9/11 and challenges, I think it's been interesting time to see people really stepping up and showing the best they have to offer.
Yeah, I agree. And David, when we talked a couple of days ago, I was fascinated by the fact that you had been announced in February, and you had that whole time from February to July to think about being the dean of innovation of all jobs at a higher learning institution that is being fundamentally impacted by what's happening. So we can dig in a little bit later into what you plan to do now that you're there, but I'm curious just what that time was like, and what your thought process was, and did it accelerate and fire up your synapses in terms of new ways to operate the business there and to contribute to that?
I was on my job at Yale until the day I left. And so during that time, from February until the end of June, I didn't really have a ton of time to think about my new role here. I was working with all of my colleagues at Yale on what was the most important task there, which was how do we keep our students safe? How do we keep our faculty and staff safe? How do we continue to run programs until the end of the semester, until the end of May? So it really wasn't until the end of May or early June that I got an opportunity to think a little bit more about what all of this meant. But I did get, during this period already, here's a funny anecdote, I guess, from my side. The original plan had been for me to be a visiting professor here for 3 months, and that would have meant to spend 1 week physically here in Lausanne every month in April, May, and June. And the idea was you get to know some people and maybe can look for an apartment for our family and all of that. Of course, that didn't happen. So what did happen is a couple of hours on Zoom early in the morning with colleagues in Lausanne, and then the rest of the day on Zoom with colleagues in New Haven. And so what that did do, though, is it didn't give me time and space to think sort of medium and long term. but it exposed me to, I think, what Ivan was just describing, which is how people swing into action in both institutions, right, and become innovative and creative when they have no choice, right?
Right.
The two institutions responded somewhat differently as a result to their circumstances, their resources, their abilities, and so on. But in both cases, you could just see like faculty doing things that, just a few weeks earlier you would have had to twist arms, overcome obstacles, convince people otherwise, but they were so committed to ensuring that their students or their clients would continue to learn that they did all of these things. So that was really exciting. So I saw the institution that I was going to join, really just firing on all cylinders. And so, since being here, I've been trying to, help channel that into a particular direction so we can talk about some more. But it was just exciting to see that I was joining a place that was fully in motion.
That's great. And what I'd also like to know from both of you is, I want to open the aperture back up a little bit, and then we'll dive back deep. What is the future of education? And what I mean by that is, what will COVID and this experience, what will stick afterwards, and what might fundamentally change in regards to how students learn, the business model of various institutions, companies like Pearson in that business, at a very macro level, what will fundamentally change about, the future of education and learning? And either of you can jump in, and please respond to each other if you guys want to get a little discussion going. That's fine too.
We can ask you two questions. How much time do you have? And number two, how long can we be? Because who knows?
Go ahead. We've got plenty of time. And I'd also like to encourage those out in the audience to put your questions in on the chat string. We already have a few already. So just a reminder to put those in, and we'll get to those shortly. But Ivan, please.
Sure, terrific. No, I think it's a great question. As I said, I think, and David and I agree on this, it's a fantastic time. One of the challenge for education is how long things take. And as entrepreneurs know, it's not about being right, it's about being right at the right time. And I've seen the future many times in my career in education, and I've been wrong many, many times, because when things that take a year or two, it takes like 5, 10, or 15 years. Right. So time will tell. I think maybe a couple of macro things there. I think online is here to stay, and not necessarily basically as a permanent alternative to presential or face-to-face, but definitely as a good option for very specific situations. And as David said, it's complex for executives to jump on a plane, go somewhere for a day, 2 days, 3 days. Now it's online. It's just remove a lot of barriers to that. I think online brings tons of flexibility. And interesting enough, when you look at post-secondary, and last few years I've done that, we think about universities are primarily the institutions to serve the 18 to 24 years old. That's a very small number of the number of students going through higher institutions, IMD is a different case there. But you have a lot of adult learners actually going back to school one another to basically finish a degree or acquire a new skill. For a lot of those learners, the ability to leave the job to study full-time is unimaginable. They can't afford it. So with online, basically, you have a chance to democratize the learning process. You could make the point in the US where education is very expensive, that's still a luxury. But when you look at new formats, short courses, boot camps and others, look at Coursera, Udacity, Open Classroom and others, I think the price of education and accessibility is going to become very, very different. And I think it's critical because at the time when we need to reskill and upskill workers, I'm sure we'll come back on this, and the displacement of workers because of technology and AI automation. I think those new tools, those new ammunitions, going to be very, very critical. So I think it's a broad discussion, but I think we'll see more what we call stackable credentials, sort of a kind of a Lego what you can assemble. So if you go a little further, if I had to read the crystal ball 5 or 10, 15 years down the road, I would say that we might say an education which is less front-loaded, like between the age of 5 and 25 years old, where you spend a lot of money up front, to basically something spread over your whole lifetime, maybe with 401k for education, maybe some matching or co-investment from government and others. that will be basically fulfilled and done through multiple programs, IMDs, and other institutions, new entrants as well. So I think a very, very different landscape for the next 10 to 20 years.
So I mean, I agree with that. I think what you're capturing is that essentially a lot of constraints are being relaxed at the same time, right? Or a lot of assumptions are being sort of cast aside. I mean, you know, somebody who's worked in this space for a while and sort of trying to move things forward, I would always hear the reasons why we couldn't do something. Well, you can't really do a case discussion online. Well, it turns out, of course you can. Well, networking doesn't really work online. Well, of course it does. You know, people are not going to pay premium for an online experience. Yes, they do, if it's not just compelling content, but really compelling pedagogy and a select group of people, right? So a lot of the sort of reflexive barriers that people have put up have now sort of been shown to not be the case, which means going forward, if people sort of put those constraints back on, it's by their own choosing, because we've all seen that you can do things differently. And so for me, this really means that we can think much more creatively about how we want to do education. I think this, you know, there's no reason why much of your education needs to be crammed into 4 years between 18 and 22, for example. There's no reason why it has to be, you know, in our programs, executive programs, full days. You know, for some programs that makes sense, but the only reason why we used to do full days was because we couldn't have people here for 2 hours and then tell them, now go stroll around the lake for 5 or 6 hours and think about it, right? But from a learning point of view, that may very well be more conducive to actually spread learning out, to embed it in practice. So I want to be clear, for many things, it still makes sense to bring people to this place, right? There's something about sort of physical co-location, spending the full day together, the intensity, the creativity. But for other type of learning, we can actually achieve better results by spreading it out, embedding it, and all of that. The only reason why we have the same 30 people Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in a week-long program is because they're all physically here. Once we're not doing that, we can have different group sizes and so on. So long story short, constraints are being relaxed. We have many, many more degrees of freedom. And now it really comes down to, you know, what is your theory of the case? What is your strategy? What is it that you're trying to achieve? How are you going to use all of these new freedoms that we've gained to make learning more accessible, more effective, more ubiquitous, you know, more impactful? And it's just really exciting. I completely agree with you on.
That's great. And so many rabbit holes to jump down here based on those responses. But there's an interesting question that came in, as long as we're sort of at a macro level here, and thanks to Robert Joseph. I'll just read the question. How is the core paradigm of learning changing? We are still educating people in mass based on a system built for the industrial age. Everyone is learning the same thing at the same time. Is that really the best way? And either of you run with it, and let's have a little discussion about that.
I'll go. It's a great question. And you know, I've spent time in the K-12 sector before for many years. And we've been talking about personalized learning for a long, long time. At the same time, if you work in a classroom, like a high school or middle school class now versus 60 years ago, it's exactly the same thing. So I think what we're seeing now with really great technology and AI and data-driven systems as well, you can really customize and personalize instruction at a large scale. So the question then is how do you change the system to do that? And I think at the core of that is this pivot we see to the flipped classroom. This idea that we're shifting away from somebody standing in the front lecturing you for an hour and giving you 30 seconds to answer questions, like probably we're doing now, apologize for that, to actually a mode where that's a case study method used by AMD and Harvard and others, where you actually study before and the professors become a moderator, a convener to create a discussion. And so everyone has a chance to study the way they want, they have a chance to access the content, and they can invest the way they want. And the professor become this great conductor that will basically make the music come together. It's interesting because it's fantastically exciting, it's great, it's also much more personalized. It's also very challenging for the professors. It's much tougher to teach this way than it is to teach standing on a podium to many people. So I think we are going to see more and more personalized learning, not necessarily basically something you do on your own, on your computer, on your own time, but also basically in the presential and the synchronous sessions you have through classroom activities.
That's great. David?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we certainly see it here in the proposals that we're putting it together. Again, now that our corporate clients have sort of embraced the idea of leveraging technology, we can actually say, here's the part that is for everybody, and then here's a set of additional resources that learners can either leverage, or as a result of, say, a coach or somebody else saying, Drew, you'd really benefit from doing this module in addition, right? So that becomes much easier. And I haven't followed the discussion at the K through 12 level as much, but I would think that similar things can happen there. I mean, we've just seen that certainly middle school children are, better than actually do some work sort of on their own with, even outside of school, that is not homework, that is sort of new learning, right? And that doesn't mean that there haven't been many challenges, particularly in under-resourced, US K through 12 systems. But I would hope, and I fully expect that sort of progressive education leaders are thinking about how do we, take this realization that even younger students than we thought can do things that are sort of tailor-made for them, in addition to what happens in the classroom, or perhaps even things that can happen while people are physically together as they're doing different things, right? How can we use that to personalize education further? So again, constraints being relaxed, assumptions being challenged, new opportunities that arise.
And take, yeah, please.
Just a comment on what David said, I think it's at spot on. On K-12, in my view, the biggest difference between K-12 and higher ed is you have parents in K-12. And the parents, by definition, are experts in education because they went to school 20 or 30 years ago. And anytime you change something in K-12 education, you have the parents experts telling you this is not the way things should work. So I think back to David's point, the students are absolutely ready for personalized learning, individualized instruction, data-driven education, and all these things. Parents and educators are a little bit more nervous about changing the system. Let's get rid of the classrooms. Let's basically go outside. So I think with the COVID and online learning, it's a giant experiment for K-12 as well, which is also forcing the parents to actually rethink the framework they've been operating. I think colleges universities a little easier because, college students are, they do whatever they want to do. I mean, not exactly, but the parents are gone for the most part.
Right. Although, David, I'm sure there were some legacy parents at Yale who had their own opinions about what Yale should do. Well, let's take everything we've talked about and we touched on some business model issues. It may be a pre and post vaccine world, and post vaccine, we more or less get back to a relative normal, and digital is a great complement and new ways to educate, but it may not fundamentally replace. So how fundamentally might the business models change? And maybe they won't change fundamentally, but the new way of what we've learned, digital will provide new opportunities, maybe new products and services and offerings. But can either of you talk about sort of the business model, particularly in sort of the higher learning and executive education area? And either of you, please jump in here.
I mean, I think, certainly from an executive education perspective, from an IMD perspective, this has really helped us understand even better than we had before that, we're in the business of providing learning, and programs are one way of doing it, and people sitting in seats at tables in programs is that's one way of doing programs, right? But if you strip that away, it's about learning. And so I think, we used to equate learning with people sitting in classrooms. And I think we now understand even more how we can embed learning in people's sort of professional practice, how we can structure it. And so that does have some implications about, how we price, how we market, how we measure effectiveness. And we're still at the beginning of this. And so if you will, there's sort of in parallel a wave of pedagogical and programmatic experimentation and innovation that is happening at the same time. Considerations of what that means for a business model. There's a question about subscription services. That's a possibility as we start thinking about what that might look like, at least for some types of learning. If we take seriously the idea of delivering impact, does actually some of our compensation get linked to objective measures of impact, for example, right? So I think we're still at the beginning of this, but I would assume that some of that is going to happen for sure.
Yeah.
Real business model changes.
And even sort of saying, obviously same question, but I'm also curious at Pearson how they were thinking about business model sort of evolution there and innovation, particularly as it relates to to K through 12, and how do you map sort of your product strategy to where that new sort of form of education is going. But talk to us about the business model considerations that you've been dealing with, and then like maybe now that you're out, if you were starting something from scratch, what business model considerations would you have?
So first, let me take the Pearson K-12 question. So first, Pearson sold its K-12 publishing business a year ago. No comment on that, but there was a decision that it was not core for the future of the company. Mm-hmm. Not a bad business, but not core for Pearson. At the same time, I believe the fastest growing business in Pearson right now is the online K-12 schools we have. We have something called Connection Academy. Which does two things. It operates a number of charter schools in the US on behalf of states. So for example, like Georgia Virtual School is operated by Pearson. We do this in many states around the country. It's great because it's free for the learners. It's paid by the state. And we also basically have our own private school operated business there. Very, very fast growing business for Pearson. There was too much demand. And the forecast is that even after COVID, that's here to stay. I mean, we'll see, but this idea of contingency planning, this idea of flexibility in the system is becoming very central. Not every learner gonna go to study in online K-12, but schools need flexibility. And I think a lot of people are appreciating, when it's well done, the value of that.
Right.
In terms of the challenge, in terms of the business models, I'll come back on the last question, which is my personal perspective there. I think there is something interesting that we don't talk enough about. Right now, it's a black swan for universities in the country. And I'm not talking IMD, which first is not in the country, number two, it's somewhat different. But universities in the country are losing revenue from foreign students, which are typically paying full tuition. They're losing money from ancillary activities, sports and others, and they're also now being asked to refund some portion of tuition. When you look at a school, which is typically a fixed cost model, which has been going up and up the last 20 years, and you expect basically a 10 to 30% decline in funding, that's what McKinsey is predicting in there, that's not trivial. And out of the 4,000 institutions in the country, I mean, Clayton Christensen, that many of you know, said half of them will disappear within 10 years. 3 years ago, people laughed about it. Now, people say it could be as much as that. 70% of the schools in the US have less than 1,000 students. So the reason I mention this is because in terms of business model, anything that companies can do to take costs out of the system and improve the experience will be welcome. And maybe just one idea there. When you look at the first year of college, you have a lot of common classes, like, one-on-one accounting and others. As you can study online, as you have more options, people will start demanding better quality at lower cost. So one thing I've been thinking about, doesn't mean I will do this, but can you actually create a number of common classes, highly produced, high quality classes like masterclass and others, that will basically be taught by all the schools for the first 2 years. And then you really have, the potential, the very specific lessons from the college for year 3 and 4. Mm. But how do you find some ways basically to provide that core education at much lower cost? So I think there will be a lot of opportunities around cheaper, faster, better, what defines innovation and disruptive innovation, to really provide a better experience at a lower cost, because students will not be happy anymore with some mediocre experience at a high price.
Right.
Now they realize they don't have to travel the world, they don't have to cross the country, they can go online and they can get a degree. And interestingly, maybe just a quick perspective on Europe versus US, having worked for a British company. It's always interesting for me when I talk to my British colleagues, when they look at education versus the US is very transactional. I'm gonna spend money to get a degree. I'm gonna spend money to get a better job. I'm gonna spend money to get a promotion. I think the Europeans still have a somewhat romantic view of education. It's not a negative comment, and I think there were some of the questions asked. For better, for worse, and maybe for worse, there is this idea that if I pay money for education, it's first and foremost about getting me a job. So what about the rest? Be a better citizen. What about the rite of passage? What about all these things? So I think there'll be some interesting questions around soft skills, liberal arts, and some of the concepts which are less core now, but people are very nervous about the future outcome and job.
So if I can jump on your previous point where you talked about using technology to offer a set of standard courses, sort of jointly produced across the board. Both Yale and IMD are part of something called the Global Network for Advanced Management. It's 33 top business schools from around the world. Think of it as Star Alliance or One World for business schools. It's the first alliance of its kind. And in the spirit of delivering a better experience and taking cost out of the system, one of the things that we did is exactly that idea, but flipped around. So the most expensive thing in a top MBA program is actually the elective offerings. Everybody has sort of a set of core courses, finance, marketing, accounting, and so on. But students want choice and flexibility when it comes to electives, and you end up with this very, very, very long tail of electives. Some of the classes become quite small, and students need those. If you want to go into renewable energy project finance, you need a couple of highly specialized courses that somebody who wants to do luxury goods marketing does not need, right? So what we actually did, pre-COVID, but it's been massively accelerated by COVID, is to organize online courses, bringing together faculty at one school with students across several others. We call them SNOCs. It's perhaps not the most creative name, but it's small network online courses to contrast them with MOOCs, with massive open online courses, right? And we used to do 10 or 12 a year, and now as a result of COVID, we're doing 40. And so now you have the possibility of getting the core of your MBA in Hong Kong or in Bangalore or in Santiago de Chile, with content that is sort of locally optimized. But if you want to take that highly specialized course on luxury brand management, well, our colleagues at HEC Paris in France are ideally positioned to offer that course to the couple of students in Chile and India and in Hong Kong who are interested in it. So that's a different way of doing something very similar to what Ivan said, which is using technology not as an end in itself, but rather to enable something very different, which is to stand up a pool of shared electives that facilitate student networking, new experiences, but really that specialized knowledge at a much lower cost and much greater value.
Right. I would think in terms of what you guys are doing at IMD, David, is the opportunity for micro and very niche sort of education, and maybe at a very premium price. Digital provides that. I mean, you can certainly do it in your traditional format. Before I want to dive in. We've got about 10-ish minutes left here, and I want to talk about sort of managing and leading through transformation and get your best practices on that. But there was a question here, which I think is important. We talked about the paradigm of learning, and how do you see measuring the impact, the KPIs? We didn't really talk about how do you measure success, particularly as now these new types of products and services are being launched in digital and virtual. And let me start, I suppose, with what have you both learned, David, while you were still at Yale and now at IMD, and Ivan looking at K through 12, and then what you were doing in your division. Any best practices that have emerged so far, sort of in regards to this sort of new normal or digital and virtual learning? What has really sort of hit you hard, where you're like, yeah, that's here to stay, and this was really effective, and talk a little bit about the metrics side of it as well.
Yeah. So, we take impact very seriously. And so we do pretty rigorous impact assessment at the end of all of our interventions here at IMD. And we do something that most other top business schools don't do, which is 4 months later, we survey those same learners again to see how much has remained, how impactful has it been on the job. And one of the things that we look at is like, does it hold up? Where does it drop? What are the implications, right? And then you sort of close a learning loop for us in terms of program innovation. But look, I mean, the things that were true at Yale and certainly, here at IMD, I think we're doing rapidly is, realizing that you need to chunk up learning. I mean, it used to be that you have this sort of rule of 5 to 7 minute videos. That might be a little bit more restrictive, but you got to engage people. So the sort of, talking time has got to be limited. You send people into breakout groups, into buzz groups. You give them space in which to apply something. That's incredibly important. There was a question about social. We're social animals. We learn socially, and so you have to create those opportunities. So you do have to certainly when you think about a session, you have to have breaks in the action and changes in the action. Sort of scripted in. I think the hardest thing for faculty is particularly, business school faculty, MBA faculty, right? The people you want to describe who aren't usually lecturing or facilitating the classroom is you have to think much more in advance. You can't improvise on the spot. If somebody asks you a question, you just quickly go to the board and draw it up. So we have to be more disciplined that way. And so you have to make it look seamless when you send people into a breakout, when you do a poll, when you do a collaborative exercise, but it has to be pre-planned, right? So that's hard. And so far, the indicators we've been looking at is, that the live virtual sessions that we've been running for both custom clients, corporate clients, and in open programs are delivering on the same impact matrices pretty much as effectively as their sort of traditional face-to-face peers in the pre-COVID period.
Interesting. And Ivan, as you answer that question, I'm also very specifically curious what metrics Connections used specifically.
So I don't know the Connections metric, but I think those we use in higher ed are pretty similar. I think the beauty of online is you can track a lot of things. And as you know, as we supported these online programs, we would track very, very carefully the levels of engagement. And by the way, I worked in gaming before, and engagement is core to gaming. So if somebody is disengaged, they will not learn. It's very simple in there. So we look at how many times people would log in, how long they would stay, and we would sort of refine the curriculum and the activities there. We would provide more tutoring and support. But the whole idea was to make sure somebody wouldn't start falling behind or disengaging, which lead to the second one, which is basically the persistence semester over semester. In the higher ed, one of the issues people start, but they don't finish. So we have to track very carefully whether people re-enroll for the next semester, all the way to graduation. And graduation is interesting. Most people don't know that if you look at the US, the graduation rate is about 40 to 60%. It's pretty low. Out of people who go to college, most of them basically drop off. And a lot of them finish after, I think, more than 6 years, which, by the way, is a tragedy for them and for the society. It's very expensive and it doesn't work well. So tracking the graduation level. And I think really the last two things really around, the last thing is around the employability. Now is the program you're taking going to give you a chance to have a better job or better life? So it's a little more tricky to do. School have done for a long, long time, but work with alumni to see whether they've seen an improvement in the condition, better job, better salary as a result of that. Now that's for the higher level, the bigger picture there. For us as a business, we had tons of metrics because we did a lot of work on marketing recruitment. So we had a very, very detailed analysis of the recruitment funnel, conversion rates at multiple levels, from lead to qualified lead all the way to enrollment. So I think businesses have become very, very sophisticated because the costs are very high, as well as the social pressures as well. If you have a high, low graduation rate, that's trouble. That's not the right thing first. But number two, you got to attract attention from regulators and others. You're going to say, hold on a sec, that doesn't work.
And look, there new ways of measuring engagement, right, as well. I mean, this is where it then gets really exciting. I mean, when you actually do certain things via live video, you can use algorithms and track, how engaged people are. You can also look at, how constructive is their engagement in a discussion, how constructive is their voice, how aggressive is their voice. You can identify patterns. We've seen some pilots of this. Are you more dismissive of certain people than others? There's some very important sort of privacy questions that clearly arise when you're doing that kind of analysis. But when people know it, I mean, just imagine we do leadership development. Usually we put people in small groups and we have a coach stand in the corner and watch and take notes.
Right.
And now you can actually use algorithms to actually track some of this and say, Drew, look, I mean, you were a lot more dismissive of me than of him. I mean, and you can show people the data. So there's some really exciting opportunities for thinking of new ways of assessing impact.
No, that's great. Well, I kind of want to wrap, at least get a little bit in here, 2 minutes on digital transformation and best practices. So David, let me start with you, and then Ivan will give you the last word on that. David, both as the Professor David Bach and Dean David Bach, talk to us about your approach to managing through this transformational process and the best practices that you're trying to bring in your new role there and managing and driving innovation, as well as best practices that you've learned along the way in your role as an educator.
Yeah, I think we're in the phase now where we still want to encourage a lot of experimentation, right? We don't know if the optimal session length for a live virtual session is 45 minutes, 60, 75, or 90. We probably think it's between 60 and 75, but it might vary, right? We have some ideas about the length of sort of breakouts and so on. We have senses about, how much time we should have in between. So, what we're really trying to do, the faculty are experimenting. What is critical for us, what I'm trying to do is how do we sort of measure the impact of what is happening very, very quickly in real time, and then share insights from that widely across the faculty. So if a faculty member uses a new tool, there are fantastic technology tools out there that they're using. How do we quickly get them to report back to their colleagues and say, look, I used this in this setting, in this program, it worked, you can try it as well. Here's a wall that I hit, right? And so I think it's really this sort of real-time sharing of insights from experiments, so we quickly move up the learning curve. And then at some point probably in 2021 or so, we're going to have to look at this and say, look, this way of doing it really works better than those two ways of doing it. So let's converge a little bit around this. These tools work in those programs, but not those programs. So we're going to have to become a little bit more systematic. And so I think my focus really is on providing a lot of support and opportunity for experimentation, and then being right there collecting, both quantitative data and sort of, personal qualitative accounts of what's happening, and encouraging the next round of experimentation.
That's great. And Ivan, as you answer this question, I'd also love to specifically, and it's probably woven into your answer anyway, specifically around best practices around product innovation at a time like this. But I look forward to your response here.
Yeah, so I think very quickly for me, there are three pieces. One is being very learner-centric or customer-centric. And I say that because for a publishing company, this is not our DNA. Publishers always know better than anybody else. We feel, I'm not a publisher, but my employer is. So really being humble about listening and understanding what people need. Yeah. And it takes a lot of discipline. I think the second thing is on the operating model, and David covered that, the try and learn. I've just really not be shy away from placing bets and trying things. Obvious comment, but it also means putting the incentives in place or not having the reverse incentive not to do that. And I think a lot of companies say one thing, but they penalize you for trying things and failing. So I was very clear with my team that if we don't fail, that means we're not trying hard enough. And we're a public company going through a turnaround and so on, it's tough to do. And I think the third one is the partnership muscle. I think being humble enough to realize that you will succeed by working with the best companies, the small startups out there. And I said muscle because that's something you have to build over time. And again, some companies are better than others. And it takes time really to create this muscle with the idea that I always go back to this stuff, make it easy for people to deal with us as an employee, as a customer, as a partner. And I think it's a very humbling experience. Is it easy for somebody to partner with us, a startup? Will they knock on our door? And the answer is often no. I mean, we don't know who does what. There is no, so I think those three things together, this centricity, this risk-taking approach and incentives, and this partnership muscle, I think are the three things that I think need to come together to really create this innovation.
Great. Look, gentlemen, fantastic discussion. We're a little over time. We've almost taken the full hour, and I appreciate you staying on all the way almost to the end of the hour. David from Lausanne, Ivan from Atlanta, Drew from New York, signing off. We'll post this soon on a new editorial publication, speaking of product innovation that we're launching around digital transformation. More to come about that. And we'll have a session again next week and more details about that. So again, Ivan and David, thanks again so much and have a wonderful weekend. And I look forward to staying in touch with both of you.